Well, let's begin with the obvious, and that is that Queens has a history. But actually, that is not obvious. If any of you saw the 8-part series by Rick Burns in New York, the video history, how often did Rick Burns mention Queens? Right. How many of you have read Gotham, the Pulitzer Prize-winning history of New York up to 1898 by Mike Wallace and Ted Burroughs? They mention Queens twice, once in connection with cemeteries. Granted, they also mention horse races, but they don't go into the fact that we were the horse racing capital of the world for some time. It is a surprise that Queens has a history, but it should not be, because how can you talk about the history of New York City without discussing the history of Queens? That's the point, and yet most histories do not. I want to take you through a history of histories of Queens, which is about the most boring thing that a historian can tell you about, is about other histories that you're not going to read. In the 1800s, history was what? It was antiquarianism, trying to get every dumb fact that you can and get them in there because you don't know which dumb fact is more important than any other dumb fact. And actually, it's the job of historians to take the dumb facts from the not dumb facts. But if you just put them out there, they're all dumb facts. But so if you collect them all, and I know that I've done chronologies of sports, there are a lot of dumb facts in a chronology of sports. So we have antiquarianisms. Who are the great people? What are the great names that we have to remember? And no one really reads those anymore because they don't have the history that's relevant to us, what we need, what speaks to us. In the late 19th century, we started to get these epic histories of places like Queens and Brooklyn and Long Island. These would be 3 and 4 and 5 volume sets of the history of a place, including every aspect from manufacturing to farming to builders. They would have biographies of the great men who paid for the books to come out. And so if you go to the Queens Library, you'll see these multi-volume sets that have everything in it, kind of an encyclopedic approach. But by the mid-1970s, we had a new kind of history that took root, not only in Queens, but in other parts of New York City, and I would think in other places as well. And this was when we started to look at our own places, our own localities, and creating a history of the place we lived. And the question is, why in the 1970s in New York City did we start looking at these places? And make no mistake, it wasn't professors at Queens College, no offense, or God forbid Harvard and Princeton or Columbia who were looking at Richmond Hill and Woodside and Woodhaven and Ozone Park. It was Queens people, local Queens residents or school teachers or young people who said, there's something worthwhile here. And it's not an accident, because in the 1970s is when New York City was going under. We were losing 1 million people in the 1970s. Neighborhoods were declining. The quality of life we had come to expect was deteriorating in terms of crime and civic services and mass transit. And suddenly people are looking at the history of a place in decline and saying there's something worthwhile here. And so you have this grassroots championing of local history in Queens for a purpose. And it was, don't write us off. And it's, there are places here that are worthy of preservation. And by preserving these places, we will preserve Queens as a place worthy to live in. And you know what? That's what happened in New York City. From the 1970s to today, we've gained 1 million, 1.5 million, depending on the census undercount, 2 million people. And these neighborhoods are now solid and worth living in. And it's not an accident, and it's not because of what happened in Borough Hall or City Hall. Just so that you have a map, Queens, 1836. I might add in the, today, we have those Arcadia books for every neighborhood and every place. And there are hundreds of these books, dozens and dozens just about Queens. And don't you wish you had come up with that idea to market Arcadia books? But they're on cemeteries and Shea Stadium and Flushing Bay and Jamaica Bay. There are dozens of these, and everyone is his own historian now. You're collecting all this information and presenting it to the public, and this is in the internet age. Who the hell needs books when everything's online? Well, everything isn't online, and it's the job of the historian to bring it together so that you can make sense out of it. And that's the beauty of these little Arcadia books. But now my question is, we can all study local history. We have, this is New York, Greater New York, 1836. But what's the point? Why are we studying local history? What difference does it make? And especially, we keep saying Queens is the most diverse place on the planet. Well, what difference does it make to the people living in Queens today what the history of a place and a people that has nothing to do with them and their family except the fact that they now live in Queens, which is where these events took place? And so really there's a challenge to find meaning in the history of a place, find meaning in the history of Queens, and it's not always easy to make that argument. But as a historian, I assume that it's easy to make that argument and necessary. When we look at, I titled this talk, Rural County, Urban Borough, and Diverse City, which kind of takes us from 1836, the mid-1800s, where there's one kind of Queens, to the mid-20th century urban metropolis, pretty much built by the New Deal in the 1930s, the 20th century city. And then what we have today, this postmodern metropolis, accommodating more people than we ever thought we would need to in this borough. And the constant thread through all of this, I'm sorry to say, is that Queens doesn't have an independent storyline. Queens doesn't have a history that you can write in and of itself. Queens is born, it matures, the end. No, Queens has no existence other than its connection to New York. Queens is a creature of New York. What New York needs, Queens provides. And that's really what we have to think of. What transforms Queens over these centuries is, well, what does New York need? And in the late 19th century, New York needs a place to go to the beach. It needs a place for rural entertainments, recreation and leisure. So you have these enormous hotels in the Rockaways. The Rockaways was a resort area beginning in the 1830s, oddly enough. You've got in College Point these picnic parks where unions and political clubs and other organizations, church groups, would get on a boat or get on a trolley. They'd come all the way out to College Point, and they would engage in a day's recreation because you can't do this in Manhattan. Well, they do have Central Park in Manhattan, but, you know, the Central Park is basically thou shalt not. Thou shalt not pick flowers, thou shalt not go on the lawn, thou shalt not play baseball, thou shalt not anything, not drink beer, God forbid. And so if you want to have a good time, come to Queens. So you had these picnic parks where you would people could play baseball. By the way, in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, baseball was illegal on Sundays. It was illegal on Sundays until like 1919 or 1920, if you can believe it. Baseball was illegal in the city of New York, except in Queens, where we said, yeah, so. It's like we basically, you know, people really would come out to Queens and break the law by playing baseball and drinking beer on Sundays, much to the consternation of church-going folk. But, you know, that it's the outlet for what New York needs. We had no major population centers. New York has 1 million people. Queens has 100,000. New York has no room. We've got nothing but room. If you don't want to live in the crowded metropolis, you live in the suburban, enclaves that Queens builds. These are the magnificent suburban neighborhoods for the middle class that Queens pioneered. The middle class of New York needs a place to live. Queens will provide it. Richmond Hill, you've got the map on the right, which shows each one of these yellow dots is a house, and it's yellow because that means it's a wood house. So you've got these large wood frame houses, which basically is the picture on the right, which are generously spaced, which is the future. Doesn't everyone deserve to live like this? You don't deserve to live in a tenement. You deserve to live in this kind of respectful suburban enclave. This becomes the American dream, and it appears in Queens out of Manhattan. Queens also has room for what New York doesn't. When New York doesn't have room for manufacturing, we take factories in Queens. Steinway and Sons moves from Midtown Manhattan to Astoria, Queens, partially to get away from the socialist unions, partially because you've got room to expand. So you have factories and industry moving to Queens because that's where we have room to spread out and create these modern factories instead of squeezing them into a tenement. And then you have other uses that New York doesn't have room for, like garbage. I wish I had a picture of the garbage, but New York dumped its garbage out in Queens. That was the solution. Before there was Fresh Kills in Staten Island, there was Jamaica Bay, which was an enormous garbage dump. If any of you, when I was a kid driving along the Belt Parkway, you just drove through mounds of garbage on either side. We would roll up the windows because it was that intense. Flushing Meadows, as was mentioned, an enormous garbage dump. All of these marshes on the edges of the city. New York has to get rid of its garbage, send it to Queens, no offense. But this is Greater New York, 1898, incorporating the 5 boroughs. And now I get to be the wonk that I need to be, and that is, this is the change in New York City's history from 1890, which is before we became part of the city of New York, to 1930. And you'll see that in 1890, Manhattan has 1.4 million people, and Brooklyn has 839,000. Queens has 87,000 people in 1890. In 1930, Manhattan has 1.8 million people. Queens has 1 million people. Between 1900 and 1930, we went from 150,000 people to 1 million people. Where do you put homes for 700,000 people? They have been repairing the Whitestone Bridge for 6 years, 7 years. In that time, we built housing for 700,000 people in Queens in the 1920s. New York needs a place for people to live. Hello, Queens. And you can see that in Queens, we grew between 1920 and 1930. Queens grew by 130%. And at the same time, Manhattan's population is actually declining. People are moving out of Manhattan, they're coming into Queens. The same with the Bronx, and there's always good old little old Staten Island off to the right. And this is what we have to get away from. This is Manhattan. This is the kind of living environment that is not what we want for the people of New York City. Because the great progressive tradition of New York is we deserve better. The people of New York deserve better. We deserve universities, we deserve libraries, we deserve clean water, we deserve quality housing, and that is the progressive liberal tradition of New York City, and that is what is built in Queens. This is what we're getting away from. 1900 to 1930, Manhattan had half the people of New York City in 1900. By 1930, it had a quarter of the people. Queens went from 4% of the people of New York City to 15%. We're spreading out. Queens has room to take everybody in. Brooklyn, once you're in Brooklyn, it stays the same. I'm really struck by how Brooklyn really doesn't change through all these numbers, We're Brooklyn, we don't change, we don't have to, we're cooler than Queens. Yeah, thank you. What's the solution? How do we solve this crowding in Manhattan? How do we do it? This is the solution. Mass transit. Except this is mass transit in New York. This is one of the funniest movies ever made. It was made in New York. It is a silent film called Speedy. It is about the last horse car in New York City, and Harold Lloyd, the gentleman in the middle, that's Harold Lloyd, runs the last horse car in the city, and it is one of the funniest movies you will ever see, not today. What is the solution? Mass transit. The railroad goes from Long Island. For years, the railroad would stop in Long Island City. You'd get off the train, you get on a ferry, you get to Manhattan, then you get on a streetcar to a subway. It takes forever. 1910, we get Penn Station, which brings the Long Island Railroad directly into the heart of Manhattan. And what that does, it explodes these railroad suburbs, not only on Long Island, but also in Queens. People living near the railroads now have a quick in and out to the city. The city of New York built bridges to Brooklyn and Queens. The Williamsburg Bridge goes to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. But anyone who follows the geography knows that when you get off the Williamsburg Bridge, you just keep going and you're in Queens. It opens up Ridgewood and Glendale and Middle Village and Ozone Park. All of those places are now connected by trolley directly into Manhattan, and they're going over the Williamsburg Bridge. It spreads out the population through this direct connection. 5 cents gets you from Ridgewood by trolley into Manhattan. The Queensboro Bridge does the same for northern Queens, opening it up Sunnyside, Jackson Heights, all the way Corona to Flushing. The number 7 line and the N train going to Astoria, those 2 lines, if you look, there's nothing there. They built those subway lines through the middle of vacant land over a dirt road. They built a subway line over a dirt road. The city said, you want to build a subway? You're going to build it there. And within 10 years, there were 300,000 people living along that subway line. Thanks to the Queensboro Bridge, you're able to go over into Manhattan. Long Island City, this is Bridge Plaza with the spider work up above of the trolleys and the subways coming together. And within a few years, it looks like this. It's the most complex elevated subway line station in the world, with trains coming from 3 different directions, going to 2 different directions in Queens. And what are we doing? We're building elevated lines through the middle of, there's no one living there. Who's going to pay the fare? Nobody when they build it. Within 10 years, everything's built up. When we have the new city, we have new boroughs and new homes. The most interesting fact for me is that we built homes for 750,000 people in 10 years in Queens. And the government didn't do anything but lay out the streets and the sewers and the water system. The city of New York, the state of New York, the federal government didn't build one house. It was all done by the private sector. That's the solution in the 1920s to the housing problem. Affordable housing. The private sector built affordable housing for 750,000 people in 10 years. Like this. You can buy this house and rent out the second floor. You now have a part of the American dream, which you can't if you're in a tenement. We have model tenements like this. This was actually showed at the World's Fair as model housing in New York. These are all over Woodside, Sunnyside, Astoria, Ridgewood. And we also have model housing, the most beautiful railroad suburb in America, Forest Hills Gardens, 1912. Upscale housing. This is the solution to the housing problems of New York. Jackson Heights. With landscaped inner courtyards, with fresh air and greenery. You don't have this in Manhattan. Park Avenue apartments don't have this. Sunnyside Gardens with enormous blocks in the middle. This is what Sunnyside Gardens looks like today after being a historic district. But we also have housing like Rego Park, the Real Good Construction Company. That's where Rego Park comes from, the Real Good Construction Company. And here they are, building housing by the hundreds. This is the solution. This is mass-produced, affordable housing. And that reform housing tradition continues after the war with Fresh Meadows. What builds the 20th century city? The New Deal, Robert Moses. How many of you think Robert Moses is a hero? I'm alone again. He gets such a bad rap, but just imagine New York without what Robert Moses built. You cannot. We would strangle in traffic. And here you have Robert Moses here, Fiero LaGuardia here, and they're making the plans for the groundbreaking for the World's Fair. This is one of the parkways Robert Moses built right on the terminal moraine. They create the infrastructure for the 20th century city. Our borough was made after World War II by what Robert Moses built. Without this infrastructure, we're strangled. And now, of course, we are the most diverse place on the planet. And I want to finish with more numbers. I love these numbers. You can see Queens' population goes from 1.5 million to 2.2. How many of you think that Queens gained only 2,000 people between 2000 and 2010? How many of you think the Census Bureau blankety, 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 blanked? I mean, really. I mean, I live on the 7 line. Spare me. So this is the growth of Queens, and again, you can see Manhattan keeps losing population until about 1990 when it starts creeping up again. Brooklyn, pretty much the same, except for once in the 1970s, between 1970 and 1980, Brooklyn loses 500,000 people. If you want to know how bad it was in the city of New York, Brooklyn lost 500,000 people. They left. They didn't all go to Staten Island in Florida, but it was a really trying time. And this is the final fact. In 1950, it's really remarkable that across the city, 23% of the population of New York is foreign-born in 1950. 20%, less than 20% in 1970 is foreign-born. Now, this is because we had the closing of the Golden Door in the 1920s, no more immigration. So we don't get the influx of immigrants by law during these decades. And what we have at that time is the other aspect of Queens, and that is that living in Queens was an engine of assimilation. During these decades, you had the creation of Americans out of all of the world that was in Queens, that came to Queens in the 19th century, the early 20th, from Little Italy and Germantown and all these other places. They were all becoming Americans. assimilating into a common culture. That is, by 1970, Queens is, what, 21% foreign-born. And a lot of those are old people, people who had been born in Italy, born in Ireland. 1965, we have the Immigration Reform Act, and now look. But it's all of New York's becoming more diverse. 24%, 28, 36, 38% is foreign-born in New York City today. But look at Queens. It outpaces every other borough. We are as diverse as any place else, but we did it more intently and faster than the other boroughs. And the question is, why? And secondly, is it possible for Queens to be an engine of assimilation again? Thank you.